Hello, tune in listeners, and hello to tune in viewers if you are joining us as you are watching this, which you may be. I am your host, Kealah Parkinson, and you are listening to or watching Tune In Radio for Your Mind, Body, and Soul. And today we have a very special guest on the show that I'm excited to welcome. And her story is a story that she's sharing with the world because it's something we can all relate to. And I think this is a very fascinating concept. We're going to talk about mindfulness and the ways that it shows up in our everyday life, just like we do every single week on this show. And we're going to talk with Sarah, who's the new guest who's joining us, about how she was unconscious for a while, got all kinds of twinklings and inklings, right? And then started to pay attention and eventually found hope and this really exciting ability to embrace exactly who she is on her journey at every stage. I don't know if she would agree with me on that, but I think that is the consensus she's come to. Listeners and viewers, please help me welcome to the show, Sarah Elizabeth Mangiarelli. Hi, Sarah, welcome to the show.
Hi, thank you so much for having me. It's a pleasure to be here.
I'm so glad to be here. It's a pleasure to have you. It's a pleasure to talk about all of this and to have read the story that you are bravely putting into the world, which is exciting. Sarah is the author of When the White Picket Fence is No Longer Enough. And it's a captivating title. It's like, what is this, right? It is not a Lifetime movie, right? But it is a story that a lot of us can relate to in a lot of different ways, especially women who are excuse me, continuing our journey of self-discovery in a world that doesn't always leave space for that. And so I think Sarah has captivated and captured this very well, captivated my attention for sure. I also want to quickly say the title, When the White Picket Fence is No Longer Enough, is written by Sarah Elizabeth. Stop right there, right? And then we're introducing Sarah on the show as Sarah Elizabeth Mangiarelli. And that's kind of like bringing us into this concept we're talking about, worlds colliding, because you have your business name and now you have this author name and you're sort of going out in the world and being like, hey, it's all me. So tell me wherever you want to start with that concept of how you're showing up in the world as your full self.
Well, I think, to start showing up in the world as our full self, we almost have to start looking at who we're not, right? I really had to decide, the parts of life that felt inauthentic in the middle of a beautiful life. And that was really where I found myself back in the 2016, 2017. I was in this life that looked beautiful to the outside world and truthfully surrounded by wonderful people. And yet inside, I felt completely alone. And I think that that's a really challenging place to be in when by, all external measures, you're living this gorgeous life and should be happy. But to me, I felt like there was something missing inside. And so, I talk about in the introduction to my book how even my name became something that just didn't feel authentic. My married name, which is Mangiarelli, and the name, the last name of my children, started to feel like a mask that I was wearing and a role that I was playing rather than who I was inside. So when I took this step to start putting myself out there, I only felt comfortable using Sarah Elizabeth. Mangiarelli as my married name didn't feel like it fit, and my maiden name didn't feel like it fit. So, right now I am trying to navigate how I blend Sarah Elizabeth with Sarah Elizabeth Mangiarelli or just Sarah Mangiarelli. So it's still a continuous journey for me, even now that this book is published.
Yeah, and because you're a finance executive, right? And so you have this day job and this whole persona, right? And that I wonder, has that felt like a mask also, or is that something you continue to embrace?
So it's been interesting. I don't know if it feels as much of a mask, but it was an aspect of life that I had to figure out how to integrate.
Yeah.
So I put this book out there and I was really scared of what my professional world would think of me if they thought I was going to be somebody that, was now into all this woo-woo beliefs, or if I could still manage the day-to-day business. So it's been a blending, but I will say I have found such a warm response when I've dared to share it with my professional colleagues. I received tremendous support and love coming back in ways that I didn't expect. And I think that in and of itself speaks to how much this world needs us to step out in our authentic selves, even in the business world.
I love that. And I think that's really important. And I think that It's fun to be able to show up as our whole selves, but it takes a lot of bravery and courage. And initially, I guess it's supposed to be like really vulnerable, right? It's supposed to make us feel really vulnerable. We're doing something new and different, and we could be rejected by the tribe. So, like, I understand why, right? Like, it's very scary for us, but you've done this great thing, and you have, I think, at this point, considering what you've written and what I've read about your life, you found that ultimately it's going to be okay. It doesn't mean it's not going to be hard or painful, but ultimately it's going to be okay. And so, I guess that's a little bit of a spoiler alert, but that book is really it gives us so much hope if we get that message from it. Sarah, let's talk a little bit about the book. I'm going to do something for a second where I'm going to first read a quote that is part of the bio for Sarah Elizabeth Mangiarelli. And one thing she is quoted as saying, oh, of course it just disappeared, is this. I'm going to share a piece of this quote. I share my darkest moments so others aren't afraid to share theirs. And again, that's what's beautiful about a teaching memoir, which is the genre of this book, where you're sharing a part of your life journey and it's relatable to everybody. So again, I'm just going to speak for a second and share some quotes that I found beautiful and highlighted in my copy of the book, which is available. While I'm calling that up, why don't you tell people where they can find the book?
Sure, you can find the book by visiting my website, which is www.sarahelizabeth.icu. And it's also available on Amazon and Barnes and Noble, and it will soon be available on Audible as well.
Love that. Congratulations on that. Okay, so
Thank you.
the bookmarks that I I made the bookmarks in my copy, and I highlighted these sentences, and I'm just going to read these in a row, even though they come from different chapters, because these, I think, really give the essence of the story that she's sharing, and they allude to other things. But when you kind of, it goes from basically like pretty early on to the end of the book, and it's just a few quotes. So one that I loved, which is it really encapsulates what you're sharing with us. She says, "I was trying to both move forward and not let go, creating an exhaustive and no-win scenario for myself." So she sort of set us up here in the early part of the book with some things that are happening, and how, again, as you said, how beautiful life looked on the outside, but internally there was a struggle. And that internal struggle, I just want listeners and viewers to kind of check in with yourself for a second and be honest for a second, be mindful for a second of this moment where I'm going to read again. "I was trying to both move forward and not let go, creating an exhaustive and no-win scenario for myself." I think that's so relatable. Maybe it's the type A in me, but I find it to be so relatable. And then she says later, "I wonder what the world would be like if we all stopped to realize the struggles so many of us, every single one of us, are going through inside." This leads into an anecdote where you're in the emergency room and you're watching a parenting struggle, right? I'll talk about that. I'll save some of that for later. But you eventually share another great insight there, where you talk about, let's see, get to that one, where you talk about maybe if we could start to raise a generation of parents who feel like they're in it together. You said maybe we could start to raise a generation of parents who feel like they are, quote, in it together. And so this idea of like, we're all isolated with our internal struggles, but so many of us are sharing them. And if we can just find a place to talk about, I thought that was beautiful. The very last chapter, there's a quote that I also love, which I think really paraphrases the whole thing. "It turns out I am falling in love with being the girl who can get knocked down and come back up smiling over and over again." And I just love it. So, I mean, like, you might be like, okay, cool, that's wonderful, but what is the story? So, Sarah, what is the story?
So I think, the story for me, and I should share, I started writing this not with the intent of publishing. I started writing this because I needed to figure out what was going on inside of me. And in full disclosure, I thought that I could get all of this out and I would be like magically healed. I thought I could expunge all of these feelings and all of these decisions that were completely uprooting the life that I had built, and be healed. And in that journey, as I started to write down what I was going through, starting with, my childhood and the wonderful moments of my childhood, but also those familial dynamics that make you look at the world in that first glimpse in a very specific way, and also yourself. And I had to really work through how I carried those lessons into my marriage, into my professional space, into how I thought I was going to raise my children. And when all of that sort of collapsed on me, I had to really sit in the rubble and decide, okay, who am I and what type of life do I want to build? And if I can't stop life from happening, if I can't control life, which I really truly thought that there was a period of time where I could control life and nothing bad was going to happen, how do I learn to flow within it? And how do I find the beauty within it? And what I found was a greater sense of peace within myself and stability within myself, regardless of what was taking place in the world. And I thought, gosh, this is empowering. This is where you feel in control, not when you can control your circumstances, but when you can control what's taking place in your own body. And the story talks a lot about my children. You know, I have a 13-year-old daughter and an 11-year-old son, and they are my greatest teachers for sure. And the story weaves in how we live our lives, the three of us, not in a life of perfection, but in building a life that feels really good and peaceful to us on the inside, regardless of how it looks to others on the outside.
See, that's so authentic right there, right? And I think that not I guess not everybody in the world is raised this way, but I think that the bulk of Americans are raised to be, doing the next right thing, right? Showing up, doing what's right externally, getting that good grade, joining that team, right? Raising your hand and saying yes when you're asked to volunteer or whatever that might look like. And striving for the next goal and achievement, right? And it's highly external, and we are an extroverted society, and so there is a whole lot of this whole like extra energy, the outer energy that we really focus on, and unfortunately, it can be to the detriment of focusing on our interior. And you talk about later in the book, you talk about your faith journey to your spiritual journey and how that added into it. And I have to say, there were like little I think hints along the way as I was reading this. When I got to the third section called hope, I was like, oh, this is a nice surprise. Like all of a sudden there's like this really deep spiritual experience that you've kind of been having all along that you start to share a little bit with the reader. So um you also share in that section about how you did grow up going to congregational church there in Massachusetts or Maine, was it? I'm sorry.
Maine, yes,
Sorry.
Maine, yes.
People always say Indiana, Iowa, Illinois to me, right? Like,
Right, right.
yes, yes. And Maine. And so, and then you realize later that it could be even deeper than you had experienced there, right? And so, yeah, tell us a little bit about some of the things that first started kind of niggling at you to make you go, is the white picket fence everything? And am I done?
Yeah, so trying to think of where I want to start.
Yeah.
A lot of it truly started with the birth of my daughter. And as I had alluded to, I thought that I could build a life that, the ground didn't shake underneath. And that was my sole focus. And when I had my daughter, I realized how not in control of life I was going to be. And then I had a son 2 years later who eventually we had him diagnosed as level 1 autistic. So he sees the world in an entirely different way and challenges my perspective. But I think, I was raised thinking that when I became a mother and an adult and a wife,
Mhm.
I would have all of the answers. I would have all of the wisdom of the world and, life would be good. Like I would have arrived at this point. And when my children came into existence, it made me stop to say, I'm not so certain that I have all of the answers figured out. And then when you start pouring your all into everybody around you, the big question I had was, is this it? Like, is this really all that's there for me, and not just for the ones around me, but for me too? And so I started with a journal prompt. One single journal prompt is really where my writing journey began. And it was, what's your greatest fear?
Ooh.
And my greatest fear was that if I was not a mother, a wife, a professional, I wasn't anybody. And that's a really lonely spot to be in. And so I would say that was the beginning of the fractioning, is when I started to say, is there anything else out there that makes me me, or where is my place where I can feel like I am that truest sense of me? And when we find ourselves in a state of chaos, it's really easy to blame everybody else around us. It's my husband's fault, it's my kid's fault, it's my boss's fault, I don't have enough money. We can find plenty of reasons to explain why we're feeling that inside, until you start reflecting on how you're not showing up the best that you can possibly be in those dynamics and relationships. And sometimes it's because we don't know those deeper parts of ourselves. So I would love to say that it was this big flashy moment, but it really wasn't. It was this slow decay. And suddenly I just found myself in a spot where I just couldn't continue going on in the trajectory that I was going. And that's when everything fell apart and we started to go a different way and to rebuild.
And so, I don't know how much of your personal story that you want to share today that, well, people can read the whole story, right? And so I don't know how much of it you want to share and how much you don't. So I'll let you lead us and say, like, what came next that's important for people to know about maybe, what you thought your life wouldn't look like, but it did, and the world didn't end.
Right. So, I am a child of divorce. My parents got divorced when I was in middle school. And so when I refer to building a life where bottoms don't fall out, I thought that I could build a better marriage. I thought that I could build a better foundation and a better home. And in some ways, I would say that I think we succeeded in that. But you can only run so far from your problems until you start really reflecting about, what's going on inside.
Mm-hmm.
So it was really when my marriage fell apart. That was that first moment where we had to say, okay, are we going to repeat the cycles of our parents? My ex-husband came from a family of divorce as well, or are we going to do this differently? And that was really the first part of rebuilding a new life, not something that I had expected by any stretch, but we were able to build a life that still maintained our family, even though our marriage was no longer intact.
Mm-hmm.
And I would say that was almost from an external perspective, that was really step one of building a more authentic life, even though it included the death of an old life, as part of that.
Yeah. And I mean, sometimes that can be exactly what happens to us. So we're going to talk some more to Sarah Elizabeth Mangiarelli, who is the author of When the White Picket Fence is No Longer Enough. After we take this quick station identification break, to remind you listeners, you're listening to Tune In. It's radio for your mind, body, and soul. I'm your host, Kealah Parkinson, and we broadcast on WVLP 103.1 FM, as well as streaming live around the world at WVLP.org. Season 6 of our show is underwritten by Kiki Productions, Inc., communications coaching, teaching exercises to help you cycle out of fight or flight in the moment. With a mission to create individual harmony to add peace to the world, Kiki Productions, Inc.'s philosophy is when you are confident, focused, and authentic with your message, you are a magnet to those you wish to attract. Find out how you can speak your truth with love at Coach Kiki, KIKI.com, or connect with Coach Kiki on Substack for custom inbox goodies for all your human feelings. And we're talking with Sarah today about this book, When the White Picket Fence is No Longer Enough, which is available bn.com, Amazon. It's also available at your website, you said, I believe, right?
Yes.
sarahelizabeth.icu. And
Yes.
so great, wonderful. And so I say get that book if you're not driving your car or in the middle of a work meeting when you're listening to this, which you shouldn't be listening to this in a work meeting, but if you should be very present, of course. But I say, while you're listening to this, grab your copy and see some of the great things we're talking about. So Sarah has just shared with us how she had this idea that she would build this unshakable foundation and have a different marriage. And then yes, she got to that, but it didn't look like what she thought because divorce was still part of the equation. So let us hear a little bit more, if you don't mind, about like how you did do divorce differently and still created an unshakable foundation for your two kiddos.
Right. So I think our primary focus was our children. And we had gotten to the point where we weren't fighting for our marriage and each other, but we also weren't fighting each other anymore. We had looked at it as our marriage didn't work, but our family is going to, and we chose to show up for our children, even when it wasn't the easiest. So, when we go to events together, we sit together. When we have activities that are taking place or upcoming special moments, we make sure that we go as a family unit and we're there to support each other. And I think what we wanted to show our children is that love can change, but it doesn't have to go away and it doesn't have to become filled with anger. And
Mhm.
I do understand, I'm fortunate in my circumstance, and I do understand that not everybody may be this lucky. We weren't dealing with issues of substance abuse
Right.
or physical abuse. So, I do want to say that not everybody has that same opportunity. But I do think no matter what the circumstance is, you always do have that choice to put the children first and not use them in a negative light or as a pawn within that relationship. And we can help them build the emotional tools and skills so that as they continue to grow and enter into relationships, they have a strong foundation and they're not searching for voids or going into relationships with unrealistic expectations that you can keep life out.
Yes, I love that too. I love that so much. Okay, so I'm going to share a personal anecdote also, because sometimes I do that here too. And why not, let us all relate to each other. I grew up with parents who themselves were both products of divorce in an era when that wasn't the norm, right? And so, like, they had both graduated from high school in the late 60s, and their families were kind of like breaking apart then, which there was like this whole culture clash in the world in the US, right? Like hippie movement and all of this. And we did see like a lot more divorce come into the forefront. And that happened to both my parents' families. But in the small community where they both had grown up, it wasn't happening everywhere, right? But it happened to both of them. And I think they kind of found each other through part of that. And so they have always remained very rock solid in we're not going to fight in front of the kids and we're going to find ways to keep dating. We're going to stay together. And they have celebrated over 50 years of marriage now. I think it's 54
Wonderful.
this summer, right? And so it's amazing. It's amazing to me. And they do continue to date and to find things because even in their 70s, they get, of course, bored with each other and they have to find
Right.
ways to bring the love in. And they model this, which is amazing. But when my sisters and I grew up and got married in our 20s and 30s, each of us, we had this phone call one day where we were like, what is wrong with us? Why do we fight so often with our husbands? Because we did not know that fighting was also part of marriage or could be and was still a way that you could communicate. We did not know that all along while we were sleeping or when we were at school, our parents would hash it out because they kept this from us completely, right? And so we
Okay.
had this
Yes.
unrealistic expectation, and we thought all fighting meant we were going to get divorced. Because I also have to say that in that marriage that stayed together no matter what, around us, all of our aunts and uncles and even some of our grandparents continued to get divorced repeatedly, some of them. And we
Hmm.
just saw like this, it was like they were like this island of consistency, this sea of all of these different things. We would like suddenly lose contact with cousins we had, close relationships with, and they moved halfway across the country or things like that. And it was like a lot of chaos. And then they were just like this stability. And we just thought, oh, this is a working marriage. The rest don't.
Right.
And you must never
Right.
ever fight. Our cousins would tell us like, oh, they just started fighting a lot and then they had to get divorced. And so we were like, guess we're getting divorced. We just got married, all of us.
So
Yeah.
I think that speaks so much to the need for vulnerability in all relationships, though, and a level of authenticity. It's unrealistic to think that you are not going to have those moments of struggle with, especially your closest partner.
Yeah.
And also, learning those skills as to how you can overcome that. So, while for me, my path required me to go in that divorce trajectory, and I think a lot of it was because I had to determine who I was
Mhm.
individually, and I couldn't do that within a relationship. It had nothing to do with my ex. It was something that I had to do within myself, and I couldn't do that when I had those roles that I was playing. But it's certainly not a book that is either promoting divorce or thinks that you can't get to that level of authenticity within yourself while staying in a marriage. I think it's really like what you said is that we have to recognize that there is no perfect dynamic and choosing to have that argument when you need to have that argument and learn how to work through it, and have those moments where you're still choosing to date each other and choosing to grow as individuals and together is really what the primary focus of being vulnerable in all of our relationships is about.
Yeah. And I mean, some other show and an episode can take on the idea of like, our marriage is realistic, this idea of staying together
Right.
for all these years, right? Because there's so much pressure on that to have like one life partner you're doing it all with. And so, I think part of what we see about the statistics of the divorce and whatever is because that is just a reality, right? And we have autonomy and choice in this day and age and in this country. And so, yeah, it does happen. But I will say, when we were talking at a virtual coffee that we had previously, I was like, I thought this was going to be all of like, kind of a behind the scenes horror story and the white pick, right? And I was like, this was like not a tragic divorce. And it was refreshing. It was unexpected. There were still lessons to be learned from it. And I think that sometimes we think we can only, maybe it's just me, but I think maybe I just think that I can only learn from like the extreme examples. And I think that, Sarah, you have done a great job in this great story that you're sharing with us about, you have done a great job of being able to share like this is the real nitty gritty, and also it doesn't have to be extreme and dramatic for us to learn from it. I mean, you've got some extreme things in here too, I'm not saying that there aren't, right? But that piece of it in particular.
Right. And I think, I love to do the storytelling aspect. And that's something that even within our household, my children and I have created that environment where it can be a relatively basic, mundane, ordinary task, such as washing the dishes, where you can build within that moment lessons where you're meditating right there on the fly in the middle of washing your dishes, or it can be a simple conversation with your child after school that has significant meaning to it, even though it's a normal daily occurrence. And I think that is, definitely a takeaway that I would love readers to have from my book is that it doesn't have to be these fancy, huge, extreme moments for us to take away a really valuable lesson that's far greater than just that isolated experience that we're dealing with.
I love that, the significance of storytelling and how we can get lessons from our own life stories that we're living, right? That can be applicable to us later and also to others around us. So, just for a second, well, let me quickly also say to readers, you're listening to WVLP 103.1 FM. And then, Sarah, I want to ask you, how hard has it been to get even more vulnerable and decide to put this out there? Because you said you were writing this initially as like, self-healing and like a way to kind of like get your own lessons using storytelling in this great way. And then you were like, you know what? I think others can learn from this. What did that look like? How did you get there?
Oh, goodness. It hasn't been easy.
Sure.
Writing far easier than clicking that first email that went out saying, surprise, I have a book that I wrote, especially because nobody knew I was writing this book. So I had two friends and my daughter were the only ones that knew that this was in the works until the book was complete. And I really had to get to that point because if one person had looked at me sideways and said, why are you doing that? I would have stopped. I wasn't in that place yet to be vulnerable. But even signing up and agreeing to come on your show is a huge step out there where I'm just continuously trying to push myself. Just because I feel like every time I do, the response I get is, gosh, I needed to hear that.
Mhm.
Or I'm not alone. I'm not the only one that's struggling or feeling this way or feeling guilty that I'm not happy in my dynamic or I'm getting frustrated with my kids or I feel lost in my job. So, the feedback that I have gotten has continued to propel me forward. But it's definitely been a continuous process of forcing myself to take that step out there.
Mm-hmm. That's beautiful. I love that you've done it. And I still am wondering, like, what was that moment where you were like, I think I am going to share this. Can you tell us anything about like what that felt like internally for you? If that's too private, you just tell me no.
No, it actually it wasn't me. I had a very close friend that I had worked with for years, and he had seen some of my bits of writing, and he was one of the ones that knew that I was writing this, and he was just like, "You have to do this." And he said it in such a way that I was like, "Oh, all right, I guess I have to do this." And that was really what made me do it.
That's great.
So, it was just that one person that believed in me that gave me that momentum to put it out there.
Yeah.
So
I love that. But then you also got like some little like signs of support from the universe along the way. You share that in your book too.
I did, yes. So, one of the stories that I share in the book is when I was away with my children in New Hampshire, and we had just gone away for the weekend, and I had sent the book proposal into an editor for the very first time. And I hadn't heard back from her, and it had been, like a week. Like I was thinking that I was going to hear
Yeah.
back from her right
Right.
away,
So
because
just read
that's
it.
that
Yeah.
right immediate
Totally.
response type
Right.
A. Yeah. And I was sitting in the room, and it was early in the morning. The kids were sleeping. I had grabbed my coffee and got back into bed. And I thought to myself, what in the world am I doing? I have no business doing this. This is like, who do I think I am? And I leaned back and looked across the hotel room, and there was a picture of a white picket fence. And it was the only picture in the entire room. And I thought, all right, there we go. So
Um,
I did. I got up, I took a selfie with that picture in my morning chaos. And I said, okay, thank you. And then a few days later, I heard back from the editor. And, as a good editor does, she had lots of recommendations and edits, but she loved it. And that right there kept me moving forward.
yeah. And she was like, this is a book and here are the edits. And then it's going to be out there. Right. And
Yes.
there's so much validation to that. Right. Like I did the thing and this is how the next step of the process works. So, um, we haven't talked about like what we're going to talk about on here. We said like we're going to talk about the book and we've got no scripted.
Okay.
It's just I want to make sure that people understand that as I then ask you like what have been some of the lessons you've been learning along the way as you go into like this next leg of the journey is being that girl who's you're loving falling down and getting up again. Like what is that looking like now?
I think the biggest lesson is that I'm actually never done learning. I thought I put this out there and I thought, okay, well, that's done. And then I said, okay, well, but now that it's out there, what do I want to do with it? What do I want people to take away from it? How do I want to continue sharing my message? And it's forced me to continuously be vulnerable again. I was just answering an interview question the other day about, how do you think you changed the world? And at first I wanted to go off on, well, we take care of the poor and we feed the hungry, like all those typical first
Right.
responses. And then I said, my gosh, I have to just change myself, right?
Yeah.
Like I still have stuff inside of me that I need to work on. So who am I to go out and tell other people how they should fix their problems or come in and try and save them or judge their circumstances
Yeah.
and think that they need saving when I still have my own inner work that I need to keep doing. So, I don't think the lesson is ever over. It's almost like you just climb to another level of a stairwell and
Yeah.
then you have a whole nother flight of stairs ahead of you. So, and my children are 13 and 11, and they prove to be a new experience every single day, and watching what they're starting to tackle in their own lives. I'm stepping into a new role as to how to love and guide and protect and also let them live their own life. So even through them, I'm constantly being challenged to either change my perspective if the thoughts that I had had before no longer resonate, or to say, all right, I can stick with my faith in this direction or in this value or in this belief. So it's just that constant editing, I guess, of our own thoughts and paths and beliefs, especially.
I think that's really beautiful and that's helpful. And I wrote down, I've been taking little notes on our conversation too for our show notes that I'm going to we'll share with the listeners later too. But that quote that you just said, I don't think the lesson is ever over. I mean, I do think there are many of us who think of, like you said, when we're younger, like, I'm going to grow up I'm going to turn 18 and I'm going to know everything, right? I'm going to graduate from high school. College will just be about getting that business degree or whatever, I'm choosing. And it'll just be about that, niche specialty for work. And I'll already know all the other things I need for lifing, and then
Right.
and then lo and behold, we have these websites now that are like, hey, here are some life skills you may not have known and you're in your 30s or 40s. And so you can go on here and learn how to fill out an insurance form or whatever it might be, right? That no one taught you overtly. And so, that concept that we're still learning life skills, that kind of smacks us in the face sometimes. And it's like, oh, what's wrong with me? Or like, why didn't I get that? Instead of like, oh, this is how it works. I continue to learn and grow, right? And
Right.
then the same thing is true for our interiors, that we continue to grow and to learn and to evolve and to mature. So, is there anything that you're hoping to learn next?
Goodness. Hoping to learn next. Interesting question. I think, with each new experience, sometimes a lesson pops up when you're not expecting it, right? So, I would love to continue to learn how to navigate in those relationships and really walk the walk, right? So,
Yeah,
trying to kind of test out everything that I've learned in a wide variety of experiences and situations. I don't know, it's not necessarily something so concrete, whereas I want to go learn X. Do I
right.
continuously love to learn? Yeah, it can be anything from astrology to investments. I definitely have a little bit of scattering when I want to absorb information, but I kind of feel like the lessons that I love learning are those little ones that remind you of the importance of the life that we're living, inside and externally, and just how interconnected we really truly all are. So that's a tricky one. I don't know if there's, I want to learn ABC, but do
Right.
I want to keep learning and absorbing? Yes, absolutely.
I love that. So I'm writing down the time code of that because that was just a bomb. That was really wonderful. That's so much. Thank you for sharing that with us. That's so beautiful. And then I have to make sure I got the time code right. Okay. So we're getting close to kind of the last quarter of our show. I'm going to go ahead and just jump in here and just remind listeners again, you're listening to WVLP 103.1 FM. We stream live around the world from Valparaiso, Indiana, just outside of Chicago, the Vale of Paradise at WVLP.org. And you can also find the show on the TuneIn Radio app. No relation, but this is Tune In, and it's radio for your mind, body, and soul. I'm your host, Kealah Parkinson, and Tune In is underwritten by Coach Kiki, author of the newly released title, My Moody Daybook, a season of mood tools for people with feelings. This daily devotional covers topics on all your human feelings, taking the hot topic of emotional intelligence to the next level of personal application. Called by some, quote, a field guide to human feelings and the book you'll want on your nightstand, it is available now on shelves and online at Barnes & Noble, Amazon, and more, including an ebook format. Search My Moody Daybook to discover your own relationship with your human feelings. We're talking about the feelings of growth. We're talking about the experience of growth and how it's universal, even when it's personal, with Sarah Elizabeth Mangiarelli, who has written this beautiful memoir called When the White Picket Fence is No Longer Enough. And I understand that you are already working on another title, even though this one has just been out since November. So what's coming up with that?
So I have a lot of different ideas in the works, I would say. So, one of the things that has come back in feedback through this memoir is I love your stories, but how did you actually get there?
Mm.
And I think for me it was a very organic process, and a lot of it because I just didn't have a lot of options to go and find some of that concrete steps to help me along my way.
Mm-hmm.
So there may be something coming out that is a little bit more concrete. I don't want to say um, like a do-it-yourself type
Yeah.
book where it kind of leads you through that. I think I love storytelling, so it'll always incorporate a lot of the lessons learned from my stories, but just to kind of help readers on their own journey take some certain and concrete steps towards finding their most authentic versions of themselves. So I do, I also have a child who's autistic, as I had mentioned earlier. And the perspective that I have gained from trying to see the world, both from his perspective out and how the world perceives him, has been a tremendous learning opportunity. So, most likely, there will be some information coming out about that as well. But yes, I feel like the more that I have written and the more that I have shared, more information comes to me that I feel would be of value to others. So, yes,
That's
more to come.
That's wonderful. And if you ever do writers' workshops, for instance, as a means of self discovery and understanding and storytelling, come back and tell us all about those. I mean, if you do virtual or in person ones, it'd be really fun to promote and connect and get listeners and viewers to be able to do this because you shared with us that it was one journal prompt that really got you on this major path of self discovery that started a big change in your life that became an ongoing change you were willing to embrace. Yeah.
Yes, I don't think that I did anything that anybody else can't do. It's just really taking that time to sit down one on one with yourself and really being able to look at yourself in the mirror, forget the world around you, forget the relationships around you, really look at your own reflection in the mirror and decide, is this who I want to be? And if not, how am I going to go about changing that? So I do on my website, if you click on the ingratitude tab, you will be asked a few short questions, and then you will be brought to a downloadable notes
Oh, beautiful.
ebook, so to
Thank
speak, that has journal prompts that are key themes from within the book, but it just tries to help the reader start to process the lessons that I've gone through and apply them to their own lives so that they can do their own self-reflection.
Well, that's beautiful. I could tell, like, definitely, right? Like, you being able to get people to do this work too is certainly the next step for you and for people who are
Yeah.
interested in this because there's so much. Again, you've been able to be this vulnerable. You've been able to learn from these lessons. You've been able to write them down and to get like a whole arc from it. And so I just think that's so wonderful. And this is exactly what we talk about with the concept of the teaching memoir, right? That it is
Right.
really applicable and universal, even though there is a very compelling personal story that's part of that. So, we haven't really gotten too much into that, but I'm just wondering in the beginning, you have a wonderful quote from your dad who supported you, and you talk about your kiddos. How have people reacted with you about showing up also in your story? And was that something you shared with people first?
So I did share the book with my family, including my ex-husband, and my daughter had read it along the way, but she read the finished copy before I finalized it for publishing. And mostly because this is my story, but they're involved as well. And I think, the key takeaway though is this is just my perspective, right? I have two older sisters, and we talked a lot about, we all experience the same family dynamic growing up, but we all had a little bit of a different take on it because we are all individuals. And even with my parents, I was looking at it from a child's perspective, but I wasn't the parent in that household or at that time of, our society that, they have their own different lens of it. And I think where the power is in learning to respect another person's perspective of the same experience and growing from that. So yes, my dad shared a quote. I was very nervous to share it with my parents and my sisters because I had a wonderful childhood. So yes, it did break and fall apart, but I wanted to make sure that they understood that I wasn't looking back at it from a perspective of anger. It gave me lessons that I needed to learn and wounds I needed to heal. But there was no intent in that. There was no malice in that. It was just the life that we had. So I was very nervous to share, but they surprised me completely with their support and their love. And when my dad asked if he could write like a little note of love to be added in right before it went to the publisher, that was wonderful, for him to include that. So in a lot of ways, it's created a little bit of a ripple effect within my family. We've had deeper conversations that we never grew up happening. So, now that we're all adults and we're having these discussions, and it's like, oh my goodness, I didn't think that the book would open that door for unguarded conversations even within my family unit. So
That's
it's
beautiful.
it's been a journey. Yeah.
Yeah, that's so beautiful. Like, what a wonderful thing to have that that refreshing, unexpected extra blessing on the end of that.
Yes,
Yeah, I love it.
absolutely.
Well, so now we are at the very end here. We just have about maybe 10 minutes, let's say. I'm looking at my time code again. And yeah, I'm going blind, so I have to keep moving these glasses for people who aren't seeing. So I think it's just an age thing. I'm not actually going blind. I should really qualify
Right.
that. Yeah. that. That's not the case. So yeah, in the last like 10 minutes, Sarah, I would like to ask you, is there anything that we haven't yet shared? I will say there's one piece we haven't talked about yet that we can talk about if you want to, and that's that in the heart of this, there really is also like a little romance story, and it's beautiful, right? And so it's not, again, not the purpose of the lesson, but there's also this beautiful little piece. How much do you want to share about that for people who haven't read it yet?
Yeah, well, and even that it was a romance and a love and one that I will treasure forever. But at the end of the day, I realized that the lesson was truly for me to fall in love with myself again. And it wasn't, I think a lot of us, especially as women, we can get swept up that we need that man to come in and save us and to fix our problems. And if we just have that, everything will be okay. And don't get me wrong, I'm still searching for that soft place to land at the end of the day.
Yeah.
I'm not downplaying the importance of that, but it reminded me that I had to first learn how to really love myself and really show up for myself and save myself and choose myself before I could put myself in a dynamic where I was choosing everybody else. And, he definitely lit a spark inside of me and reminded me of what an unconditional love truly is for another, not just your children. But at the end of the day, that journey was still about learning to love myself first. And I think that that's really important for anybody, but especially women as we're navigating so many different roles and dynamics.
Yeah, I think so too. And you and I can only speak to that female perspective and experience, but I think it's important for all humans to really learn that self-love. And I just, want to speak to this piece, which I don't think you disagree with, that so many males on the planet have been conditioned to not just not self-love, but not even know how to like really love other people in a vulnerable way, right? And to just, show the one expression of anger as emotion, and to not be able to be emotionally expressive beings, and like especially for my Gen X generation and older, right? Like there just was like none of that coaching happening. And so that's where I also have Gen Alpha kiddos like yours, and they
Yes,
are a whole new breed, right? And they're
they
definitely
sure are. Yeah.
teaching me. I'm supposedly the somebody who learns about emotional intelligence and teaches us and whatever. And my kiddos, they speak it way better than I ever have in their like 10 to 12 years on the planet, right? And they are just like always calling me out on it, like, Mom, use your tools. And I'm like, oh, this is
Yeah.
how to do that. Thank you. Thank
Yeah.
you. But I like what you're saying too with us about how like the lesson's never over and the journey is always there. And I will say for me that's been one of my insights with having on the parenting journey and being able to learn in a very different way, that I don't become just the teacher on the mountain as the parent, right? That it is really symbiotic in this way, and that as I'm continuing to learn new things, that it's okay for me to be learning with them some of these things in life. So yeah, I think that it surprises me that they feel safe with a guide like that, because I wouldn't have expected that. I thought we were
Right.
supposed to be, the teachers on the mountain. Yeah.
Yes. Yes. And I may have shared this when we had our first, virtual coffee conversation, but I had heard this quote that was something along the lines of, we can't raise our children the way our parents raised us because the world that we were raised for no longer exists.
Doesn't
And
exist.
I think, we naturally, as adults, you do get stuck in your ways a little bit because it's the world you grew up in and the world you knew. And when it's changing so fast, we have that responsibility to guide our children and teach them, some of those basic foundational tools, but also to learn from them. And you did bring up, again, while my main focus for or audience is the women and mothers, I think there is a lot that men can learn from this as well, especially in that unconditional love chapter. I think a man is often raised where they are supposed to be the giver,
Mhm.
and receiving of that love is a challenge, and having somebody see them for who they are, on the inside as well, is just as important as us, as us as women.
Yeah, I agree. That's wonderful. Well, I think this has been really amazing. Is there anything that we haven't shared with listeners that you would love for them to know as we wrap?
I think I would just love for listeners to know that you're not alone on this journey, right? There is such a sense of isolation, and especially in what we're dealing with social media and this image of perfection, that all of those feelings and insecurities and fears that we try and navigate internally and by ourselves because we're scared of what people may think if we can't do it all and be it all. It's okay to let the swords down sometimes. And I think if anything else, that level of vulnerability is going to connect us and sustain us in such a deeper level than trying to be the person that we think we have to be to make a situation easy for everybody else to handle.
Thank you so much for sharing your journey with us, for sharing this book with us. We're talking about this idea that we can surrender and trust the process of growing. It's been wonderful. And listeners, readers, viewers, go out and get the book, When the White Picket Fence is No Longer Enough by Sarah Elizabeth, AKA Sarah Elizabeth Mangiarelli. Thank you for being on the show.
Thank you so much for having me.
We'll see you later, meditators.